Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Benjamin, and welcome back to a continuation of our series on the political history of the United States, where we're actually talking about the period between the end of the 7 Years' War and 1775, early 1775, and um, specifically the start of the American Revolution. Now, at the end of the 7 Years' War, of course, and before I forget, let's talk about this. Thank you all for tuning in, of course, and I want to thank everyone for the support they've given me. And like, comment, subscribe if you like the channel, and if you really like the channel, a subscription on Patreon would be pretty cool. There's a link to that in the description. And it's actually snowing outside, so I've got the window not open, but I've got it so I can view. And I really like it when it snows, and it's fallen at a decent clip. It's not gigantic flakes, but like it was kind of earlier in the day. But we've got about an inch and a half right now, which is pretty good. So anyway, let's get back to it. So after the 7 Years' War, of course, the relationship between Britain and the colonies changed. Before the war, it was a situation known as salutary neglect. Basically, Britain said, yeah, these are our colonies. As long as they trade with us, we really don't care what they do. And so America developed its own unique political system based off of the British system. They consider themselves very British, but they really only liked and really only gave support to their local colonial governments and the British government via extension. But after the war, things changed significantly. And there's a reason for this. One, wars are expensive. And I'm not just talking about the human cost and the lives lost, the property damage, all of that stuff. But I'm talking specifically the financial cost of war. Number one, during the war, prices rise. The cost of consumer goods rises significantly. Food costs increase significantly. All sorts of other things. And trade also becomes much more difficult, causing even more increase in prices during wartime. And that's the financial cost of war that I don't think people talk about nearly enough. And that really hurts the populace. But from a government's perspective, a lot of the resources they need to carry out the war effort also increase in price. Food, metal for guns, swords and bayonets and ships and cannons and artillery and all of that stuff. Metal for metals as well. Metal for bullets. Back in this era, wood. Timber would have risen in price. Timber for ships, timber for wagons, everything. Horses were a big part because cavalry was a thing back then. Still is, but not this type. Not to the level of it was back in this era. Horses would become more expensive, and a lot of horses died back then in war. George Washington had like 7 or 8 shot out from under him during the Revolution alone. You have to pay all the soldiers, and all of a sudden there's a lot more soldiers and sailors, and as time goes on you can add airmen to that too. But we'll get to Air Forces eventually. And I really do like watching the snow. Uh, yeah, so things get, and of course, like I said, you have to pay the soldiers. You have to pay the sailors. Now, the sailors could be, well, let's just say, allowed to make paid less because they could be allowed to make supplemental income through privateering. Yeah, basically state-sponsored piracy. That's how Sir Francis Scott Drake became so fabulously wealthy. He was a privateer. But anyway, so, and of course, you also have to pay the costs of actually waging the war. Um, so, Britain may have won the 7 Years' War, but they were significantly in debt afterwards. Like, it was bad. Obviously, the French were in debt as well, but they didn't have any colonies, so they just continued to tax the Third Estate. We'll talk about the French Revolution because it is actually significant to American politics and American political history. And so we'll talk about taxing the Third Estate more in the future. But anyway, the British needed to raise taxes in order to pay or increase tariffs or any other form of revenue generation that they could to pay off the debt that they incurred during the war. And they realized that there was an entire colony that they hadn't done anything with, an entire colonial empire that they had not exploited for their resources. So they said, well, whoa, wait a second there. Hey there, 13 colonies. Yeah, you haven't been paying any taxes. That was kind of an oversight on our part. Yeah, in order to pay for the war that you got us into and that we protected you from the French during, you're going to have to pay taxes now. And these will be minor. They won't be nearly as much as we're taxing our own local population, nor even as high as other colonies, such as our new Canadian possessions or what control we have over the Indian subcontinent. Won't be nearly as much as British Brits, it's certainly not as much as the Irish or Scottish are paying. But you're going to have to pay a little bit of a tax. Well, the colonists didn't like that because they'd only been used to paying taxes to their local governments. And the first tax was leveled on sugar, if I remember correctly. But basically, the big taxes during the post-7 Years' War period were the sugar tax, the tea tax, there was a tax on glass, on, I want to say it was lead, but it was important in certain things. It was one of those metals. And the notorious stamp tax from the Stamp Act. But these were the intolerable acts, or the intolerable taxes. Now, at first, there was only like one or two taxes, and the colonists were like, no, we don't have representation in Parliament. You can't tax us. We're not going to use any of this stuff. And these boycotts worked because most of the colonists were behind them, especially the ones who were using this stuff. And the reason why a lot of these were especially heinous to the colonists, for example, in Boston, they really hated the Stamp Act the Tea Act, or the stamp tax, the tea tax, but they especially hated the sugar tax. Now, why would Boston hate the sugar tax? Do they have a famous industry? Do they trade a lot of sugar or whatever? Well, actually, back then they did, because Boston was a major producer of, well, let's just say they bought a ton of sugar to make rum. Now everybody hated the tax on the stamps from the Stamp Act, which was basically saying that any significant document, such as a title on property, needed a stamp, and of course this stamp was taxed. Basically, you had to be taxed for, having the stamp applied, which verified that yes, it was real. Newspapers and letters, I believe, also had to have them. Any important pamphlets had to have them, such as a pamphlet that explained what the Stamp Act was. And gambling devices, such as playing cards, had to have a stamp on the packaging. And yeah, you can see how this would be infuriating to a trading port like Boston, where you had a lot of lower class dock workers who couldn't really afford this, but who enjoyed, well, at the time it would have been called debauchery, the debauchery of gambling, or enjoyed their rum, which would need, actually I think, which would be taxed under the sugar tax, and then they wouldn't understand all these taxes, so they'd want information about it, and then they'd have to pay a tax to get that information. You can see how it would actually really add up to a pretty hefty tax. And for them to not have representation, they didn't have any representation in Parliament, unless you ask the British, who would say each member of Parliament is supposed to take into account the interests of the colonies. And thereby you have what's known as a virtual representation. You just don't have a local elected official, but you have representation. The Americans didn't buy this at all. They said virtual representation is not a reasonable, intelligent, or good idea or thing. So, of course, they protested, boycotted. There were riots, of course. The Stamp Act riots in Boston, New York were pretty significant. And it's really difficult to see or tell who was really in control. Was it the people themselves? Was it the mob, the lower class individuals, and the common man? Or were it the American local elite, such as the Revere family, the Adams family, of John and Samuel Adams fame, the Virginia, the Southern planter class, New York merchant class, that sort of thing? Were those the people who were in control? And you can argue that there were elements of both. But the more aristocratic, the more well-to-do people who were, protesting the Brits, they tried to disassociate themselves at first with the crowd, for quite some time, because they thought the crowd was a bit too forward in their hostilities. that said, they definitely made sure to take some interest in pushing things in an anti-British direction, or at least to get their aims against with the British. They wanted things to return to the way they were before the 7 Years' War. The Brits, the Crown specifically, and Parliament, their opinion was, no, you're our colony. You have to do what we say. We don't do what you say. And this butting of heads eventually escalated continuously. And you have events like the Boston Tea Party, where the Brits, the Crown and the Parliament had basically said this government property, because the East India Company was effectively operating only at the leisure of the Crown. So it may have been private property on paper, but it was still technically Crown property. It was still government property. And it was subject to an importation tax, and if it was offloaded into Boston, into the port at Boston, it would have to go through, and it would have to be taxed at the expense of the people of Boston. So one night, the Sons of Liberty, which was an organization of people who just wanted things to go back to the way they were, they dressed up as Native American, as Iroquois, and they stormed the ships and threw the tea in the harbor. And yeah. Yeah. So that's one thing that happened. At the Boston Customs House, you also had an incident where a sentry was standing at his post guarding the Customs House after some of the tensions in Boston that had happened previously. I believe the Boston Tea Party actually happened after this event, if I'm remembering the order of things correctly. Yeah, I'm more interested in the story rather than the specific order of events. Sorry, if you wanted exact dates, you're not going to get them on this channel. With a few exceptions of some extremely well-known dates. What you are going to get is a story, the reasoning why, and that's the important thing. Coming from a trained historian. So, what happened there was some kids or young adults who worked the docks started heckling this sentry and mocking him, and eventually it escalated a little bit to where they started shouting, throwing snowballs, oyster shells, rocks, bricks, and of course a crowd was assembling, and the other soldiers who were at this customs house took up their posts and joined their fellow soldier and were sentries as well. And of course this crowd started to include dock workers and the rabble, and it turned into a mob. And we don't know exactly what happened, and we may never know exactly what happened, but we have a pretty good idea. You can actually read a lot of the testimony that happened at the trial for the soldiers that were involved in the Boston Massacre. And you can read the testimony and decide for yourself who's telling the truth, who was in the right, and whether or not you would render an innocent or guilty verdict. But the lawyer for these soldiers was the only person in Boston who was willing to defend them. John Adams. And his whole premise and argument hinged on convincing the jury that, number one, no order to shoot was given by the commanding officer. Two, that the commanding officer would have been a fool, idiot, and suicidal to give the order to shoot, as he was standing in front of his soldiers. And that, if the bayonets were fixed on the rifles, there would be no order to shoot given because of the way bayonets work, especially with those types of firearms. And that the crowd was the one ordering the soldiers to shoot by saying, "Fire, damn you, fire," as well as the fact that they were assaulting the soldiers, and that a soldier has the right to stand his ground, or that any person has the right to stand their ground, and that you are allowed to defend yourself. What did happen was that, yes, the soldiers defended themselves. And the court ruled as such. They ruled that the soldiers were free to go. I don't think it was all of them were acquitted, but it may have been. I can't remember the exact detail of that. But yeah, they held that the British soldiers didn't do anything wrong. Obviously, the colonists were not pleased with this. But interestingly, a lot of prominent American thinkers, political thinkers, thought that John Adams would serve their cause very well, because even though he was sympathetic to the anti-tax position and the pre-7 Years' War condition of the colonies, and returning to that he was a man of honor because he defended people who otherwise would have no legal representation. And that he was willing to put aside his own bias against the British in order to see justice served. But things did not de-escalate. In fact, they escalated more and more and more and more, until we get to a situation where the British crown, where the king, it was King George III, where King George III and Parliament and the British Army, the regulars, decided that we need to stop this civil unrest from becoming a revolution. hilariously causing a revolution. And we'll talk about that next time when we talk about the American Revolution and the well, we're just going to talk about the revolution and the Continental Congress, I guess, as well. Anyway, I want to thank everyone for watching. I hope you all enjoyed. See you next time. Take it easy. Bye-bye.